Robin Hood Radio welcomes you to David Freeman's Science Insider with your host, the senior science editor of the Huffington Post, David Freeman.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Science Insider. Today we're talking about neuroscience with Dr. Sally Satel. Sally is a psychiatrist in Washington, D.C. She's also an instructor at Yale. And more to the point, she's the author of a fascinating and rather scary book, a new book called Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Neuroscience. So welcome, Sally.
Thank you very much.
So, these days everyone seems to be really excited about advances in neuroscience and the way new technologies are letting us look at the brain, the inner workings of the brain like never before. Politicians are excited because they see it as a way to look into voters' brains, marketers because they think they can find new ways to develop super compelling new products and market them in ways that we can't resist. And there's even talk among lawyers that there may be a way to develop sort of a super-duper lie detection system that would determine guilt or innocence without the messy jury system. So all that sounds kind of exciting, but you're worried. Why are you so worried about all that?
Well, first I should say that the reason for excitement surrounding neuroscience in many ways is extremely well placed. I mean, it's fascinating. The brain is really the next scientific frontier, as people say, but nothing could be more true. It's the most complicated organ, and we're really in the infancy of understanding it. What my colleague and I have taken, we threw up a red flag to respond to what we call mindless neuroscience, and in fact, that's the full that's our subtitle, the seductive appeal of mindless neuroscience. And what we mean by mindless neuroscience is kind of forgetting there's a person attached to the brain, that there's just so much we can know about the meaning people draw from their experiences and the values that they have by looking at their brain. Could we know if they're intending a crime just by looking at their brain? Can we tell what they will purchase just by looking at their brain? These are really interesting questions. Some of them are technical, which is to say, do we yet have the technology to answer these questions? And some of them, I would argue, are just not answerable through neuroscience. And a prime example of that is whether or not we have free will.
Before we talk about some of these specific examples, and excuse me if I left out the word mindless, I think I may have left that out of your subtitle, Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience, absolutely. But before we talk about some of the examples, can you tell us a little bit about the technology? I mean, a lot of this new exciting work and the work that alarms you in some way grows out of the development of something called functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. So what is fMRI and why is it more powerful and so different from earlier brain imaging technologies?
Sure. Earlier technologies, probably the first was that most people are familiar with is the CAT scan. That came about in the 70s, and that is, like an X-ray, it is a structural image, which what I mean by that is it's a static picture of, well, whatever, your brain, your knee. We can do CAT scans of the whole body, and there's a lot of information on that, to be sure, but the functional technology, which includes PET scanning and something called SPECT scanning, and more recently something called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is a way of looking at organs, in this case the brain, where you can actually measure the function, not just where the structures are within it, but actually how they are working, how active they are. And fMRI, which is the one most people probably are familiar with, it makes for the most striking, exquisite biological portraiture in magazines and on TV, the Technicolor brain, which reflects a person doing a task, and the various colors reflect the differences in activation increase in various parts of the brain as they are performing those tasks. What it really measures is actually increases in oxygen as opposed to direct nerve activity, but it's considered a pretty good proxy for that. So that's what we're looking at when we see an fMRI.
Right, and it's funny, there's in my household I have teenage sons, and we watch a lot of science documentaries, and every time one comes on about the brain, I say, just wait, and they look and smile, and the show proceeds, and then at some point, someone goes in fMRI, and the certain parts of the brain light up, and they say, see, we found the center for love. We found the center
wrong,
for dishonesty.
exactly, and that's what's wrong. There are no centers for love. There are centers for emotion. In fact, that's fMRI is excellent for locating things, and that's why it's been called by people who are even more frustrated than I am the new phrenology, because it can show you parts of the brain lighting up, and neuroscientists know all this, and they're very cautious, most of them themselves. But what is easy to take away from is a hyper-localized impression of the brain. Right, this is here and that's there. In reality, it is a massively interconnected structure. And what we don't see on many PET scans is other areas that are active. You'll see parts of the brain that are black. Look, a black brain is a dead brain. An inactive brain is a dead brain. The areas that you don't see lit are areas that didn't register enough activation to be on that particular scan, but it doesn't mean they're not. This brain is buzzing all the time, and the interconnections are really where the money is. And in fact, that's where the research is kind of, in some ways, moved on. The fMRI with the various lit spots was really a way station to a more, and it had to be passed through, I believe, just from the way science develops, but to a much more sophisticated look at the circuits that are interconnected across the brain.
Right. So can we talk a bit about some of the examples of the ways in which neuroscience is creeping into these other fields, as neuromarketing and so on. You talk about political campaigns. You talk about again, development of product, Super Bowl ads, even movie Avatar. There's talk that maybe neuroscience was involved in some way to try to hone some of those scenes. Give our listeners some examples of the sorts of things that are really happening these days.
Yeah, well, the key idea behind a lot of those is the observation that has a lot of truth in it, which is that if you ask a group or even individuals, as in a focus group, what are you going to buy this item, or are you going to vote for this politician? What you get are answers that are not very reliable. They don't have great predictive value. And in fact, that's why focus groups are, well, frankly, I think since the 80s, they've started to become less popular as ways of predicting sales. They have other values, but as ways of predicting sales. So the idea is basically to cut out the middleman, which is sort of you, and go straight to your brain and see whether or not there are more what you might call even automatic responses that are registered in the brain to various questions. For example, if I showed you a picture of Hillary Clinton, or at the time this particular study on politicians was done, Mitt Romney was running the first time. It's an old study, but it's still very powerful for illustrative purposes. They showed swing voters pictures of the brains of various candidates. John Edwards at the time, as I said, Clinton, Giuliani, and so on, and tried to infer from the reactions, or I should say the patterns they elicited in the brains of these swing voters, which of the candidates they preferred, what their reaction was to those who they didn't prefer. And what I mean by prefer, they also asked them on paper who they would vote for and what their impressions were, and then They compared those responses with their brain's responses, so to speak. The problem is that, and I alluded to this before, because the brain is not localized in this neat way, it's very difficult to do what's called reverse inference, which is look at a part of the brain and say, oh, this person is scared, or this person is jealous, or this person is ambivalent, or this person is intrigued. It turns out that the various regions of the brain, and I don't mean to say that the brain is homogeneous. By no way is that true. There are areas that are more specialized than others. But take the amygdala, which you hear about all the time. That does mediate the reaction of fear. There's no question. But it also mediates reactions in response to novelty and excitement and interest. So to look at, for example, someone's amygdala, which may show enhanced activity when they look at a picture of one candidate or one commercial for that matter, and it shows activity, doesn't mean someone is scared or doesn't even necessarily mean someone finds it novel sometimes. It could just mean they didn't expect to see it. So it's very hard to walk backwards from the brain. We can't do it yet. There are some ways in where we may get better at this. So some of this is a technological issue, but as I alluded to before, some of it is just misplaced, and I can move into what I mean about that in the clinical realm.
I guess the problem is if some a political campaign buys the services of a company that purports to be able to tell them they can peer into the brains of voters or swing voters and figure out what specific hot button topics they need to hammer and how. The danger there is that the political campaign might lose some money, I guess. I mean, I guess there's some sense that the political process could be subverted and we vote for people we didn't really want because somehow they found a way to tap into our brains.
No, they'll never do it. I'm very skeptical.
Right.
They'll ever be powerful enough, to shape our opinions and turn us into Manchurian customers. But that is the dystopian extent, if you wanted to, draw it out to what I would say is an illogical but sort of frightening conclusion. And some people do. I think it's a little hysterical, but we'll see. Maybe these will get that good.
But you do talk about other things which have kind of a dystopian slant. And for instance, one is the use of fMRI to look into the brains of people accused of crime as a way to determine whether or not they're actually guilty. And you say, that I think that's, as with regular conventional polygraphs, this technology has not been allowed into courtrooms, and yet it could. And let me, before you say your answers, I'm going to say, this to me on some level, this is very appealing because I've always found it really strange that we vote on matters of fact. We determine matters of fact using democracy. It reminds me of when I was a kid, a teacher, this is not a great teacher, there was an argument broke out into this, I think, a 6th grade classroom about whether the Soviets at the time had put a man on the moon, had put an astronaut on the moon, and there was a big debate. The teacher said, oh, yes, they have, and the students said, no, they haven't. And so the teacher said, well, let's determine this by voting. So they voted, and they determined that, yes, the Soviets had landed a person on the moon, and that was settled. And, of course, it was wrong. So, and the same thing seems to exist with a jury. So, what's wrong with the idea of using a technology that's sort of a foolproof way that gets right at the heart of someone's guilt or innocence?
I would argue nothing. Nothing is wrong with that. I think that would be wonderful, except we don't have it. And that's where the problem is when you impute way too much accuracy to brain scans. And where they are used in the courtroom is mainly in death penalty cases. So you'll have a person who's on death row, and in fact, it's now so commonplace to show brain scan evidence that there have been some defendants or I guess they are convicted felons, murderers, who have sued their counsel for not having taken fMRIs of their brain and showed them in court. It's very common. The idea here is not to get someone off, as you know, it's just to avoid the death penalty. Right. And you could be sympathetic, and that's why, as you know, the threshold for introducing evidence in capital cases is so low because we'll just throw anything at the wall and maybe it'll help this guy avoid death. He'll still be punished, of course, but avoid death. But from a technical standpoint, I mean, we do have a Daubert ruling. There are all kinds of rules of evidence for introducing science in the courtroom, and the point is that we don't want to introduce something unless it does what it says it's going to do. Granted, it is a matter of human judgment where you want to draw that line of accuracy. Is it 99.9% accurate? Is 98% accurate okay? But that's a separate question. These aren't even accurate at the level of, well, I can't put a number on it because they're just not reliable. In laboratory settings, some of the efforts to do lie detection with fMRI, which would pick up increased activation based on the suppression of truth, some of those studies, I mentioned them in the book, actually have pretty high rates of accuracy, except they are so contrived. They're done in a lab setting. Everything is controlled. The person is told what to take. There are 2 items he can take, and he's told what to do with it, and there are no consequences, real-world consequences. And finally, for lie detector purposes, all one has to do is start thinking of math problems or, singing in your head, and you've already confused the brain imaging machine because there's all kind of other activity going on in your brain. So these are highly, oh gosh, I forgot the word, and it's not confounding. There's a word that you can beat them
right
easily.
So you're saying that it's a great goal, but we're very, very far away at this point from being able to have a reliable brain scan lie detection technique.
Yeah, I think that's a completely reasonable pursuit. It's just that, right? We're really far away from that, and I think that's an example of where the technology may be the biggest hurdle. But there are also conceptual problems. But probably will get better. Now, when you move on to the courtroom, this is where things get very, very confusing for a lot of people, because if I showed you that something, we hear this phrase all the time, it's in the brain. I don't know how many headlines you've seen that says something, sex pornography is a real disorder. Why is it real? Because a brain scan shows that when we expose pedophiles to images of children, they show greater activation in certain, let's say, the reward areas of the brain, nucleus accumbens and so on, than those who are not pedophiles. Well,
right.
Wait a minute. Of course it's in the brain, right? Where else would any emotion, thought, feeling, memory, intuition, intention be? All of these, excuse me, everything on our mind, if I could call it that, everything in our psychology has a correlate in the brain, and in some scans we will be able to visualize that. But it's another step to infer that a behavior that flows from the activation you see in the brain is necessarily involuntary.
Right, and this brings up another issue. I know that that's in addition to the issue of the courtroom application of this sort of technology bring up. I know that you work at a methadone clinic, and there's you talk about to the extent to which something like addiction is a brain disorder or a matter of choice, and an even bigger question arises then, which I guess is the matter of free will. I guess the ultimate end of this, research for the people who think it's really going to take us to a new world is that we'll find out basically everything we do, say, think, feel can all be determined by looking in our brains, maybe years in advance, right? I mean, what does this say?
I mean, I'm saying it theoretically, that is a true fact. Everything we do think, feel, and that is true. And then you get into a very deep philosophical question of, I'm sure you remember this from, college philosophy about hard determinism. But it basically what it has to do with if I should boil it down quickly, and apologies to all philosophers out there, but basically it comes down to, I guess, this view that the view that all our behavior and all our, frankly, all our attitudes and dispositions are caused. Well, I believe they are caused. They're caused by our genes, our biology, our environment, our history. That's true. But some people, and they're called hard determinists, and of course, at a neural level, they're determined by the series of firings of neurons. And they take this fact, which I'm going to stipulate as a truth, and from that they then infer that, and so we're not ultimately making choices, because everything we do is kind of a product of what came before it, and there could be no other choice. And I'm saying that neuroscience doesn't resolve the question of whether or not that understanding is sufficient for you to say, then there is no free will. And what do I mean by free will? I mean, can you hold people whose behaviors are determined morally accountable? And the reason I tend to be sympathetic to a view that's called basically compatibilism, which says that yes, people are determined, but that doesn't mean they can't be held accountable. And the reason for that is because compatibilists don't require what you would call metaphysical or ultimate responsibility. They require simply that people know how to reason, that they can control their behavior, that they can plan, that they can respond to incentives and deterrents, this kind of things, that they can reason and respond to reason and exert self-control. And if that's enough for you, as it is for me and Daniel Dennett and some others, then we can hold people morally accountable.
Right.
Right.
So this, and I guess on another way of looking at the same debate about determinism or accountability is, as you point out in the book as well, that the technology has given us a way, fMRI and similar technologies have given us a way to look into the brain, so that we're more focused on the brain biology at the expense sometimes of thinking about the mind. So that's the other duality here, right? Brain versus mind.
Exactly. So, that's a great. I was going to say that's a great segue into addiction, actually. And
so tell us about that, because the idea that if people have brain abnormalities as revealed by these, the scans, that somehow they're not accountable, whether it's addiction or some other problem. What does that mean as far as helping addicts or I guess punishment as well, right?
Right. And a lot of those folks say that, we shouldn't, our criminal justice system should reject one of its four pillars. Our four pillars are we put people in jail or prison to deter them from doing this in the future and other people from doing it, other people in the society from doing it, because they'll see what could happen to them. We have to contain them if they're dangerous. Hopefully we can do some rehabilitation if they have a problem that's amenable to that. And then fourth, and this is the one that's contentious, is we do it because people deserve to be punished. And we don't punish them more than they deserve. That's very important. It has to be in proportion to their crime. That's key. But they do deserve it. And that's where that pillar crumbles, of course, if you interpret the determined aspect of our existence as meaning we are not accountable. But the law doesn't care. All the law cares about is whether a person can reason and respond to reason and control themselves. For a culpability, that's what the law cares about. The law doesn't care about the cause, frankly. It could be your bad parents, it could be your bad brain, it could be anything, as long as you can reason. And that is why this is such a fascinating illustration of all these concepts. Is, if you recall, the Andrea Yates case in 2001, this Houston mother of 5 drowned her 5 kids in a bathtub. She had horrible, roaring postpartum psychosis. She thought she was the devil and she was infecting her children. And no one could be more deranged than Andrea Yates. I mean, it's just a classic case of psychosis. And they did not have a brain image in her case. I mean, this was before brain imaging existed, but it wasn't as popular in litigation. But I'm telling you, if they took a scan of her brain, they wouldn't have found a gross abnormality. It's there. It's there. There's no question. That's a sick brain. But it wouldn't have shown up on a brain scan. She got not guilty by reason of insanity, actually, the second time around, but that was a technicality. Because of her behavior, and because she could not reason she reasoned from a highly, highly distorted premise, which was that, she was the devil.
Right. So let me ask you, so you went back to the addiction idea, or I guess any kind of, pathology. Is it, you're talking about to what extent we should excuse people because they might have some predisposition. Mm-hmm. Are we any closer to finding a predisposition to behavior? So, for instance, when there's a kid is 5 or 10 or whatever, a brain scan is done and say, hey, you have a predisposition to alcoholism or to pedophilia or whatever, so we're going to take steps to intervene to prevent that. Is that something that's in the cards?
It might be for certain conditions. I know for reading. I know the Shaywitzes at Yale are doing very good work on I think imaging very young kids to get a sense of who's going to have some reading difficulties based on their language processing. But these are more neurological. We're not very good at the psychological prediction, and it's a very scary thing unless you have, unless the predictive validity is really high. You don't want to go intervening with people's brains unless you really know they're headed for something bad, and it doesn't mean you have to the intervention if we're at a point where we feel we do have good predictive value, that intervention necessarily has to be medication or anything invasive. It could be certain kinds of behavioral therapies, but you just want to know.
Right. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left, and I wonder what words you want to leave listeners with as far as interpreting kind of overhyped headlines about neuroscience, or
right.
And also, perhaps more important, what should they know to protect themselves, from being exploited or from the well, I'll leave it at that. What should people know and do about this?
Okay, I never did get to the addiction thing, but I can wind up with that. It is my area, and all last week we've been hearing nonstop about addiction with Philip Seymour Hoffman, and it was really very interesting to read so many articles about him, because it was through my lens, it was like the demons versus the dopamine reaction to his situation. Was he using drugs because he was such a troubled person, and this was a way he was coping? Did he even, want to die at the end? Who know? We really can't know what was on his mind, but it was a desperate situation in any case, with a tragic end. Or was the poor man suffering from a brain disease that, if we only had a pill for, everything would be fine? Now, it may sound like I'm exaggerating that latter view, but honestly, that is what addiction is called among many researchers and also by people at the National Institutes of Health, that addiction is a brain disease. And I have always fought against this. And what I mean by that is this brings up an issue in the book we spent a lot of time on, which is what we call the levels of analysis. And what I mean by that very simply is that addiction is way too complicated an issue. It involves psychology and the environment and the social milieu. It's far too complicated to reduce to the level of the brain. The brain is clearly affected by drugs. A drug addict's brain is going to look different than yours or mine if we, imaged it. No question about that. There's even some genetic differences, and I could go on and on about the biological differences. But if I just spent my time working with a person's brain in my clinic, I'd get nowhere. I mean, we have to talk with them and work with them about changing their behavior, talking about what's important to them, how to get through the day, managing cravings, all these kinds of things. I have no philosophical objection to medication. I work in a methadone clinic, for heaven's sakes. I mean, that's a medication. It's probably the best one we have, and it's the oldest one. But if I didn't realize that my patients responded to what I call consequences, rewards, and incentives, I would be missing one of the greatest assets we have, which is that you can do incredible things with people who use drugs in the criminal justice system. And I don't mean I'm advocating jailing people because they use drugs. That's absurd. But people who use drugs do end up committing crimes, and they do end up getting arrested. And it's the criminal justice system that uses, through what's called drug courts and other programs, some extremely sophisticated behavioral models of behavioral shaping with rewards and incentives, and with very good outcomes, which we've spoken about. So if I just worried about what's going on their neurotransmitters and not at the behavioral level, I would miss out on important therapies.
Any message you'd like to leave listeners with as far as, looking at headlines or...
And when you think of the brain, right now we're much better at understanding how the brain works than what it tells us about what's in someone's mind. Focus on mechanism, not so much the meaning.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sally. And that's the end. We've been talking to Dr. Sally Satel, who's a psychiatrist in Washington and the author of a great new book. I think I get it right this time. Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Science Insider with David Freeman, the senior science editor of the Huffington Post, produced in cooperation with Robin Hood Radio, robinhoodradio.com on the web.